Welcome to Sex Ed with DB. I'm your host, DB. Let's get into it. We talk a lot about sex education, but when I'm shopping for products to support my sexual wellness, exploration, and expression, I head to the experts at Lion's Den. Lion's Den is an adult retailer with over 50 locations nationwide and hundreds of your favorite brands. They have everything you need to explore and express your sexual side. Right now, you can use code SEXEDWITHDB for 15% off your purchase in-store and online at lionsden.com. Follow them on social media at Lions Den Adult on Instagram and TikTok for exclusive offers, deals, and giveaways. Flicking the bean, wanking, self-loving, jilling off, ménage à moi. All of these are different and very creative ways to say masturbation. For 21 days, I conducted a masturbation experiment with one of my favorite vibes ever, the magic wand. In a nutshell, I wanted to answer one question. What is the impact of daily magic wand use on my health and wellness, as well as my sexual experience when compared to regular sexual activity and no sexual activity? The results surprised me more than I thought they would. Want to see the hypotheses and the results for yourself? Go to sexedwithdb.com/magicwandexperiment to learn more.
If you're tired of hearing the same old judgmental, shaming financial advice about buying too many lattes from old white men who conveniently ignore issues like systemic oppression, it's time to join us on Financial Feminist. I'm Tori Dunlap, globally recognized money speaker and educator, and I'm a part of a new guard of financial educators. On Financial Feminist, we don't just talk about money, we talk about the ways women are affected differently by money. We're feminist first, acknowledging that your financial savviness has less to do with your weekly coffee order and everything to do with the fact that we live in a patriarchal society that gatekeeps women, people of color, and other minorities out of conversations and education about money. With fascinating guests like Nadia Okamoto, Maya Vander, Justin Baldoni, Christy Carlson Romano, Queen Herbie, and more, we dive into topics like menstrual justice, the investing gap, diet culture, the psychology of money, and more. Plus, you get bi-weekly how-to episodes like how to start investing or how I saved $100,000 at age 25. We're smashing the patriarchy and getting rich, one episode at a time. Subscribe to Financial Feminist wherever you're listening now.
So, you're ready to experiment with anal play, but you're not sure where to start. If I were you, I'd start with education and products by a company founded by a doctor who's an expert on anal sex. I'm talking about Future Method. Future Method develops science-backed products and doctor-led education to maximize pleasure, eliminate injury, and empower the way people choose to play in the bedroom. They even have a blog that puts education at the forefront, on topics both popular and taboo. Use code SEXEDWITHDB for 15% off at futuremethod.com. Let's talk about a lube I absolutely love, Uberlube. Uberlube makes sex better for everyone by reducing friction and increasing pleasure. Whether you're using it for solo sex, sex with a partner, or both, Uberlube has a long-lasting performance that lets skin feel skin. It has simple, body, and condom-friendly ingredients, is scent and color-free, dissipates when no longer needed so there's no sticky residue, and is recommended by leading doctors. Use code SEXEDWITHDB for 15% off at uberlube.com. Hello, pals. Welcome back to another episode of Sex Ed with DB. I am so glad that you're here. Thank you so much for tuning in. I love you. You're the best. What the heck are we talking about today? Today, I chat with the amazing Arielle Greenberg, who is a longtime kinkster and the author of her upcoming book, Superfreaks, all about kink and fetishes and BDSM and all these other wonderful things under the kink umbrella. And in this episode, we talk about specific kinks and fetishes with a positive lens. I really, really liked that part of the conversation. I'm excited to see what you think. We talk about great representations of kink in literature and film and music. We talk about how queerness and kink overlap historically and in the current day. And I even do a kink quiz at the end of the episode. So I can't wait for you to hear Arielle. But before that, shout out to our sponsors. Go to sexedwithdb.com/discounts to get 15 to 20% discounts off of my favorite products and brands that I work with. Please go check them out now. If you want new fun toys and kinky items, especially ones that we talk about in today's episode. And I'm very excited to read another incredible review on Apple Podcasts. This one is from Craig MD, who I actually know. So thank you, Craig. The title is The Ed I Wish I Had for Sex I Wanted to Have. This review is, what I thought was safe in college, ... was definitely not. Now I work on an HIV hotline, and I hope that more people get access to this info earlier in life. Thanks for doing this work. Thank you, Craig. And thank you to everyone else who has been writing reviews. Keep writing them. I might read yours on the podcast. If you want to write a review and rate us 5 stars, you can screenshot it and DM us on Instagram, and you also might win a prize. And now I can't wait for you to hear the kinky conversation between me and Arielle Greenberg. Arielle, hello. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. Welcome to Sex Ed with DB.
Thanks so much for having me.
It's my pleasure. I was so excited to be reached out to by your folks on your team because you recently wrote a book, and I'm very, very excited to use that book as kind of the anchor for us here in this episode and to learn all about kink today. So I'm really, really grateful that you're here. I think our audience is very kink curious and kink positive. And so I'm sure they would be thrilled, just as I am, to learn from an expert.
Thank you. I hope I am expert enough. I will say that I am a researcher, really. And some of this book is personal experience. A lot of it is things I've learned from years in the kink community, and there's a lot of research as well. So.
We love research. We are a science-backed podcast. It is very important to us to have, some rigorous research behind the things that we're talking about here. So that's great. We're really happy to have you. And why don't we go ahead and get started? Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us what you do, and a little bit, maybe you want to share the title of your book and how did you get into this field?
Yeah. So my name is Arielle Greenberg. And the field I'm in really is literature. I have an MFA in creative writing. I've taught creative writing to undergrad and graduate students for over 20 years. So I'm an academic and I'm a writer. And most of my previous books were poetry or literary nonfiction. But this book is nonfiction. I mean, I hope it's still kind of literary, and good to read. And I think I can't help myself because I was trained as a poet. But this is a book, for everybody who's interested in finding out more about kink. My book is called Superfreaks, Kink, Pleasure, and the Pursuit of Happiness. And, it has that title for a number of reasons. One is that it's meant to be a really fun book, and the chapters are all titled after song lyrics. I'm really into music. And so Superfreaks, of course, is a nod to Rick James. But also this idea of being freaky in your sexuality can be super, right? It can be really fun and delightful and joyful and nourishing. And also that those of us who have a kinky sexual orientation are sort of like superheroes because we sometimes have this kind of secret double life and superpowers in this way. So the tone of that title, I hope, gives a sense that the book is really upbeat and positive and joyful and encouraging other people to sort of celebrate their non-normative sexualities as well. I have written about gender and sex my whole writing career. Definitely identify as a sex-positive feminist. And I edited a series on the rumpus for a number of years that was in which I invited writers who identify as kinky, literary writers, poets, essayists, fiction writers, novelists, erotica writers, to write about how their kink, their personal kinks, and their writing practice overlapped, which was a super fun series to do. And was great to edit those. I didn't write one myself, but I edited them and I solicited the writers. And my editor at Beacon Press, which puts out Superfreaks, which is putting out Superfreaks, contacted me and said, would you, because she found the series on the Rumpus, and said, would you be interested in writing a nonfiction book about kink? And I jumped at the chance.
Absolutely, you said.
Yeah. And then the pandemic hit, I think, and I was so grateful to have this fun project to work on while I couldn't really go to, a lot of kink events and things like that. And I consider myself a lifelong fetishist and somebody who's been thinking about this for as long as I can remember. And I've been a member of kink community for over a decade. So that's kind of where I come to with this. It's definitely a different kind of project for me, although my last book of poems or 2 books ago, was really dirty, sexy poems about feminist sexual pleasure, women's sexual pleasure, women identified people's sexual pleasure, queer people's sexual pleasure, non-monogamy, things like that. But it's poems, and not everybody's going to read poems. Let's be honest. I'm well aware of this fact. So I'm really glad for the chance to be able to talk about these subjects in a book that hopefully is a really fun read for folks.
Wow. So you have a lot of different angles here when it comes to being a writer, being someone who edits other folks' work, being a longtime kinkster yourself and someone in the community. You have the research, as you mentioned, which I would love to get into a little bit later. I'm sure we will. But I would kind of love to know, like, as a longtime practitioner of kink, right? Like, what has really shifted over the last decades, and why are these shifts happening?
That's a great question. I think that basically what's happened is, since the rise of the internet, which I am of the age that just as I was kind of coming into my late teens and early 20s, people started having access to the World Wide Webs. Mm-hmm. And there was something called alt.sex on Usenet in the very early days, which I was an early adapter of, like when I was in college, basically. So I've been sort of connecting with other folks around kink since, the early 90s. And what I think happened is, as soon as the internet was invented, of course, people started using it for porn or, right? Of course. So we're humans. So, that has meant that there is this proliferation of information and resources and erotica and all sorts of things around all kinds of non-normative sexuality that would have previously been really hard to get your hands on, right? So there have long been, maybe always been, underground kinky publications, but back in the day, you would have had to go to a city and find that one underground store and go to the back room and ask for the stuff in the paper bags or whatever. And now, of course, you can just Google or go on YouTube. So I think that has meant that a lot more people have a name for what they do or what they love, and also are able to get exposed to a lot more kinds of things. I think that has pros and cons. I think that it's wonderful that there's more conversation, more resources, more naming. I think that can help people feel a lot less alone and a lot less shamed or embarrassed. But I also think, of course, that some of this material is not appropriate for everybody to get their hands on. Young people are identifying as kinky or like being aware of that much earlier. And, listen, I knew I was kinky from the time I was pre-adolescent. It's not like I would have had to, I didn't stumble across any material that taught me that. It's my orientation. It was always in me. But I think I'm glad I didn't have access to, sort of like really intense porn at that young of an age.
As a kid.
Yeah, as a kid. And that I made do with what I had, which was like my imagination, kids' cartoons, and the dictionary, basically.
You're just like getting off to the dictionary.
Totally. I have read many and heard like many fetishists talk about literally getting off to the dictionary definition of their thing, because that's all they had. So they just look up rope or they look up whatever it is. And then you're like, ooh, it's just somebody talking about it.
The original like romance novel is just like reading the dictionary.
Just the dictionary definition. Yeah. Merriam-Webster. Who knew? But yes. So I think that, it also Whereas I think in the past, if you were, let's say, really into high heel shoes, you would buy your like little underground pamphlet of pictures of high heel shoes. And that's it. It was very niche. Kink tends to be very niche. And so that's appropriate. But now folks can go to kink events and go online to someplace like FetLife and read about all different kinds of kink and learn about things they may have never heard of or thought of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there's also a lot more people who are like, oh, let me just try this, or who are more kind of fluid in how they identify and what they get into because they can be, because they know about these other things. Whereas in the past, I think you just went after the one thing you knew you were into, and that's what you got, you know?
Right. Totally. Yeah. I mean, I think like this point about like young people today, specifically like, 11-year-olds, 12-year-olds who are accessing porn for the first time on average, that is the age in the US. And I think it's really important that we kind of like draw this line where like young people are going to have access to the internet, like most young people do in this country, in the world. And we need to be teaching them porn literacy. And we need to say like, hey, this actually isn't appropriate for you. And if you do see these messages, like, let's talk about why that some of them are harmful or why this is really important for you to know. And like when you're 18, that is a more appropriate time for you to be accessing that content. And we can say that all we want. And like middle schoolers only really care about what other middle schoolers say, right? Like they don't give a shit about like what their parents, they're like, Mom, you can shut up now. Like I never want to hear you speak again. But I think it's important for listeners to like wrestle with this idea that like, yes, it is inappropriate and yes, kids are accessing it. So like, how do we create this like harm reduction approach for youth and at the same time not make them feel shamed or like embarrassed, because as we know, like that sticks with us later in life. And so I'm wondering, for people who are like kink positive, right? Like in your book, do you kind of talk about like how messages from adolescence and how experiences from adolescence kind of influence kink and the desire for experimentation with kink later in life?
Yeah, that is not a topic that I have covered. My book is really meant for 18 and up, I would say. And I am the mother of two teens, actually. And, so what I just say from personal experiences, my 14-year-old, his computer is in a public space in the house, in the living room where everybody can walk through. It's not in his room. His older sister's computer is in her room, but, she's 18. And for him, so I walk in and we see, and I would say that most of what he's finding that like borders on inappropriate is by accident. He's searching for a term and he's looking at an image search and there's like deviant art that's coming up and stuff like that. And, I'm open with I talk a lot about sex with my kids. I'm open, with my kids about non-monogamy and kink in ways that are age appropriate. And we just use it as an opportunity to talk about it and ask questions. And I am not averse to walking into the room, seeing what he's looking at and being like, let's talk about better search terms for this so that we get rid of some of this inappropriate content. Because that's not really what you're looking for right now. And then we also talk about, unrealistic expectations in porn and damaging messages in porn and, there's better quality porn out there and more positive and feminist and anti-racist porn out there. And there's not such great porn out there like anything else. And that when the time comes that they are interested in accessing porn or erotica, let's say, I am glad to help, like give them some tips on finding stuff that
Here's
is
some links.
Appropriate. Yeah. Yeah. Maybe not so far as links, but saying like, let's talk about what would make this, positive. And also saying, listen, most people access porn. There's nothing wrong with that. And that's okay. But it's about finding what stuff that you feel is comfortable for you and that respects, that is within the realm of respect and consent.
Totally. Yeah. Really helpful to have a parent who can speak to this lived experience. I think like, I don't know, with kink and like figuring that out, like, I feel like oftentimes, I haven't necessarily heard what you said before of like, oh, this was like my orientation as like an adolescent, right? Whereas what I think about kink is like when you start seeing media that have that, or read, books that have that, or, if you meet a partner who like wants to explore that with you like later in life. So yeah, I think that's an interesting way to think about that. I mean, similar to like sexual orientation and like the other like parts that make up your identity, like you often know those parts of you, or at least have thought about it or have had like mixed feelings about it from youth. And so that makes sense to me that like those kinds of things would also come up for kink.
Absolutely. I think especially for those of us who identify as fetishists, most people that I've listened to talk about this say that they can trace this back to early childhood. We're talking I don't really think of humans as pre-sexual at any time, because I think,
from birth till death.
Yes, right. So, but, certainly pre-adolescent, I know that I was having basically the same kind of fantasies I still mostly fantasize about at the age of 5, or 6. And I've heard other people with other fetishes talk about that in a similar way. So yeah, I do think that's a big difference now, is that people can sort of like tap in to this thing that they've heard about and be like, oh, that sounds kind of interesting, versus that experience of knowing that you have a sexuality that doesn't quite align with what the culture is telling you you're supposed to have from a very early age, which I totally agree. It's completely analogous to identifying or knowing, having some sense that you are queer or trans as, from a very young age.
Yeah. And I'm sure like listener, maybe you're thinking like, that's weird for me to think of like a young person like thinking about kink. And like the reality is like fantasy kind of like doesn't really have limits. And like there are all of these things that are impacting us around us. And like the idea of thinking about those things versus actually doing them are very different. So I want to like make sure that that is very clear to the listener.
Yes. No, I was not sexually active at all until, I was like a senior in high school. Trust me, I barely was kissed before then, but I had a very active sexual imagination, and it was all in my head. And I, and it was very, in its way wholesome, I guess I would say. Like there was no sort of trauma around it or anything like that. And I know that I've, definitely talked to other kids who know that they have, a specific kind of attraction or desire from a young age. And I would say, certainly I have many adult friends who talk about knowing that they were, let's say, gay or lesbian when they were 5, because their parent was saying, or, the culture was saying like, you're supposed to be attracted to this. And they had a very clear sense inside of them. If you talk to gay men, especially, I think you will find that almost all of them, or many of them, will say like, I had these attractions from the time I was very young. And I, before I was interested in acting on them. But if somebody said like, isn't this woman, like you should have a poster of whoever on your, like Kim Kardashian on your wall. And I was like, I really want Justin Bieber. Like that is very clear to you, right?
Totally.
Those crushes and early attractions. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's important that like the adults in our lives are like very conscientious about the way that we respond to young people. Like we're going to fuck up and we're going to like not get it right. But I do think that there needs to be some room for parents and caregivers to be like, I don't really know like what to say right now, but I'm just going to put on a good face and like do some research and then maybe come back, and maybe I'll consult a therapist or a sex educator or whoever needs to be consulted about this if you're kind of like, I don't really know what to do with this. And especially with the way in which LGBTQ plus like terms and like language and the way that we think about relationships and being with other people is shifting a lot and like changing. And so I think it's we don't know what we don't know yet. And I think it's just important that parents and caregivers are like open to like figuring that out with their kid.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
Moving along here, we need to get into kink. I would love for you as, a researcher, writer of Superfreaks, to talk a little bit about what you chat about in this book. And so one of the first questions that I have here, which is kind of like a three-parter, so take it with it what you will. I would love for you to go over the difference between like a kink and a fetish, and maybe like define a fetishist. You've used that term a couple of times now. That would be really helpful. And then some sub questions of that are like, what are some of the most common like kinks and fetishes according to research? And then what are maybe some of the least common? And I'm wondering if this least common question is maybe empowering for folks who have these preferences, or are we like perpetuating stigma by asking that, or is it maybe like both? So those are all, I'll throw all those at you and see what sticks here.
Cool. Great. So yes, I think of kink as the umbrella term, sort of like queer is, the current umbrella term for lots of stuff within LGBTQ plus identities. So kink is like the broadest possible umbrella term as it's usually used. And sort of under kink, I think of two sort of subsections. One is BDSM, and that is the most commonly written about and represented stuff of kink. But there's a lot of stuff in there. So BDSM, which you've probably gone over before in your show, but it's a really helpful, like Swiss Army knife of an acronym, because the different letters stand for different things. So B and D is bondage and discipline. So we're talking about things like tying people up with rope or handcuffs, and maybe spanking and or psychological discipline. DS stands for dominance and submission. So that's power exchange, role play kind of stuff. And most people have heard of at least dominance and submission. And then the SM stands for sadism and masochism, which has to do with getting erotic pleasure out of receiving or administering pain, quote unquote, or discomfort, or let's say sensory, intense sensory experiences, because not all sadists or masochists are really interested in like pain per se, and they don't experience it as pain per se if they're enjoying it necessarily. And then, so all that stuff, BDSM covers a lot of what goes on within the kink world, or what gets called kinky sexuality. But it doesn't cover fetishes, which are, so a fetishist or a fetish is a kind of kinky sexuality in which the focus is on a very particular behavior or object or set of behaviors or relationship between objects that's not usually thought of as erotic by the culture and the context that you're living in, but which has like an almost magical draw for the fetishist. So, the idea of a fetish comes from the original, like a folk culture fetish. We think of like a little carved object or something like that you would put on an altar or carry in your pocket or be buried with. And many of us still, use fetishes in that way. Like a rosary, can be a sort of like a fetish object almost, or crystals, in a pouch that you carry, where you feel like, oh, this is protecting me in some way, or like giving me power or helping me. And for fetish, like erotic fetishists, that's the way we use that term. It's, that can be a shoe or a part of the body or the Eiffel Tower, as I talk about in my book in one chapter. And people really feel this erotic attraction to that. And it can be let's say an action like smoking, like there are smoking fetishists where they just really want to watch someone smoke. But so let's just say that, again, this is really particular. And so a smoking fetishist, in the end, that ends up being a really broad category, because within that, a smoking fetishist might be really into seeing someone smoke a cigar while sitting in like an armchair dressed in a suit. And that is their smoking fetish. And somebody else might be really attracted to watching someone put their cigarette out with the toe of their combat boot. And those are both smoking fetishists, but they may look for like the porn that is good for this guy is not working for that guy, because what they are attracted to is so specific and different, in the end. And so there's all different kinds of fetishes. And the most common one is definitely feet and shoes. I mean, that's the one people have heard about the most. And yeah, I mean, that one comes up a lot. It's hard to quote stats on this stuff, because of course, most people don't want to talk about what they're most sexually attracted to if they think it's odd or unusual. But certainly, if like a FetLife search or things like that are representations in media are any indication, then sure, shoe and foot fetishes, and they go back a long time. And there's, definitely stuff in history about there are like examples of clearly fetishistic footwear that date back to ancient times, right? In all different kinds of cultures. So that's probably one of the most common ones. There's also kind of, because related to your question earlier about like what's changed in the last few decades, I think part of what's happened is now that people can access more information is that there are kind of kinks that trend, which I don't think used to be a thing. There was no trending kinks,
talk more about that. What's trending?
Rope, I would say. At last, when I was, last able to kind of attend events before the pandemic, rope was definitely trending. So it went from being like, yeah, there'd be some rope workshops at events that I would attend to the majority of things would be about like rope, and there'd be more vendors of rope and rope equipment and more classes about that and more websites and things like that. It just really seemed to kind of, I don't know, capture the imagination of a lot of folks in the community, and a lot of different people are certainly experimenting with it. But, historically, I would say sadism and masochism and the actions that go with those, spanking, bondage, things like that, are certainly sort of perennial popular kinks. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In terms of least common, I just think like that, as I just described with the smoking fetishes, like there's lots of uncommon fetishes out there, and some of them don't even really have a name, or even if they do have a name, like I'm a smoking fetishist, it's like, what does that mean? And there might be nobody else out there that I can find that has my particular set of like parameters and requirements for what makes the ideal fantasy of, of my fetish. And I don't know that I think that that's empowering necessarily, because I think it can make it quite hard to kind of find a willing partner and, really describe what you're into. Because even if you say to your partner, you know what, I have a little bit of a foot fetish, they might be like, great, I want a pedicure. Give me a pedicure now, boy. And that person might be like, no. I am not submissive. And my foot fetish is like, I don't want to give anybody a pedicure. I like watching people run around with barefoot, stinky, dirty feet and then like kissing those afterwards. Right. And the person who wanted the pedicure, the partner, could be like, no, I'm not into that. So anyway, all of which is to say, like, I just think the specifics of fetishes can make things a little challenging. But I don't think I hope that doesn't perpetuate stigma. I think, we can talk more about sort of outlets for those kinds of things, but I think that there is hope springs eternal, that you can find, if not a willing partner, then maybe, the right erotica for you. So you can at least like explore this in your mind and in your privacy by yourself. Or, what I would say about if you have something and your partner's just like, yeah, no, I'm not into that. Maybe they would be into playing with it by just pretending, role playing, or telling a story about it, even if they don't enact it. And sometimes that can be just as good, because for a lot of kinky folks, the psychology is as important, if not more so, than the toys and the props and the actions and all of that stuff. And I think that unfortunately sometimes doesn't get understood, or gets kind of thrown out the window, because now we do have access to all these fun toys and props and a million different kinds of rope. And you can just spend all day looking at rope colors, online or whatever. But you're probably into rope because there's something about the psychology of rope, or the dynamic of being tied up or tying somebody else up, or walking around with rope underneath your clothing, or smelling rope, or whatever it is that you're into, or being suspended, or whatever it is that you're into, that is deeper than that's about what's happening in your mind when you're thinking about that.
let me tell you about one of my favorite pleasure product retailers out there, Lion's Den. If you haven't heard about Lion's Den before, I can't wait to tell you about them. Lion's Den opened its first retail facility in Columbus, Ohio in 1971. That's right, over 50 years ago. Since then, they've grown to more than 50 outlets throughout the US, building their reputation on high-quality products, low prices, and a knowledgeable sales staff who can help you find the perfect toy. One of the many things I love about Lion's Den is that they advocate for a sex-positive perspective on intimacy and sexual well-being, and strive to break the stereotypes and stigma surrounding sex by providing comprehensive educational resources to empower everyone to enjoy life to the fullest. They are simply amazing. Lucky for you, Lion's Den is giving my listeners an exclusive discount of 15% off your purchase, in-store and online with code SEXEDWITHDB at lionsden.com. What are you waiting for? Get your amazing Lion's Den toy now. Here are my top 3 favorite things I love about Uberlube. Number 1, Uberlube makes sex feel a lot more pleasurable. It's as simple yet as powerful as that. Number 2, Uberlube is recommended by leading doctors, and its body-friendly ingredient list is widely used by people with sensitivities to lubricants. And number 3, Uberlube will not stain clothing or bedding. Any spills can be easily cleaned with detergent and water. Get your bottle of Uberlube now with code SEXEDWITHDB for 15% off at uberlube.com. What do you know about pegging? If you've seen that one incredible Broad City episode like the rest of us, you probably know that pegging involves a woman, trans man, or non-binary individual without a penis wearing a strap-on dildo and penetrating their partner who has a penis. But did you know that there are actual benefits of pegging for straight couples? I'll share a few with you from an anal surgeon and booty expert at Future Method. Number 1, reaching the full potential of one's orgasms. Prostate orgasms are powerful and can often be felt throughout the body. Number 2, becoming closer with your partner and adding new dimensions to your relationships. And number 3, learning to be submissive or dominating in a new position can be quite difficult to achieve. But when you can master these sensations, it opens the door to new relationship dynamics. Go to futuremethod.com to check out the expert-written guide on pegging, and don't forget to use code SEXEDWITHDB for 15% off at checkout for amazing butt and gut goodies. What if I told you that I did a masturbation experiment with the magic wand and the results were incredible? Don't believe me? Let me share a few things with the class. When using the magic wand every day, I experienced less stress, anxiety, and physical tension. I reported more frequent positive moods when using the magic wand every day, including higher levels of confidence. My level of horniness increased over time when using the magic wand every day. Want to see how else the magic wand impacted me positively? Go to sexedwithdb.com/magicwandexperiment to learn more. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think there is a lot of interesting pieces here around, okay, like maybe this is something that you like to just think of by yourself. And if that's what you want, then that's great because you have your imagination. And if you want to tell your partner that you're into that, there's a lot of power, I feel like, in description and like talking about things in order to kind of spark the imagination. As kind of maybe like a middle ground, if like someone is not interested in maybe acting out literally what the other person is talking about. But however, when you said the thing about smoking, when you first said that, I myself was kind of like, oh, like I don't like cigarettes. I think that's gross. Like I don't like that. And then when you said armchair in a suit, I immediately thought of Don Draper in Mad Men. Yes. I was like, yeah, I want to fuck Don Draper. Like he's very hot. That makes sense to me. So like, to your point, like maybe people feel like that is something only they have ever thought of. But people will tell you who are into kink and like people who have researched kink like you. And I read a book for someone last season who was on my podcast called Arousing History of Sex by Rachel Felton. And she has an amazing kink chapter in there. And she mentions that if you think that you're the first person to like think about your kink or fetish, someone else in history has done that. Like someone else has thought of that and like try not to feel so weird about it.
Totally. I mean, really, all you have to do is look on YouTube to
Right.
have that proven to yourself.
Or
I mean,
Twitter or Reddit or Tumblr.
yeah, right. I mean, I write about this in the book, but as a kid who didn't have access, who should have had and didn't have access to actual porn, there's so much kinky stuff in kids' cartoons because it's just like so fantastic and absurdist. And so, whatever it is you're into, there's probably some cartoon representation of it. And because of my fetish, I really was turned on by like the scene of Templeton the rat in the cartoon of Charlotte's Web overdoing it at the fair because I have like this fetish for hedonistic indulgence in other people. And that's pretty freaking weird. Like he's a rat. I hate rats. I'm terrified of rats. I can't watch real rats at all. Like, ugh. And he's talking about like eating at a fairground he's singing a musical number. He's played by a clearly gay man. Like the whole thing is just like, what? But if you Google it, you will find many other people being like, oh my God, the most exciting thing to me was Templeton the Rat.
Oh my God. See, other people.
I found like 1,000 hits for something like that of people talking about like sexy Templeton the Rat, Charlotte's Web, whatever. So yeah. And I mean, I think the Don Draper example is great because like maybe what that's really about is power or like what you're attracted to there is power or authority. And maybe the person who's into people putting cigarettes out with their high heel shoe is actually interested in submission or, in like a sense of that, or there's something sort of nonchalant about that smoker or like taboo because smoking's bad for you and cigarettes are disgusting. And so like that they have the gall to do that is like so naughty. And that's what's turn on to them. Which might be totally different than the psychology behind the turn on for the Don Draper person.
Totally.
Yeah.
Speaking of Templeton the Rat, let's talk about media. I wanna hear from you as someone who has done a lot of this research and kind of like anecdotally has talked with people and done a lot of thinking and looking stuff up for this book. Like, what are some of the best, most recent representations of kink? Maybe we'll do like one of each if you can think of it. Like one in literature, one in film, maybe one in like either TV or music or something like that.
Yeah, I love this topic. My book is really has a lot of pop culture stuff in it because I love pop culture and
Me too.
yes. And representation matters, as we know, and there's so little good representation of BDSM and kink out there. So for a film, I definitely have a recommendation that even most people I talk to deep in the kink community have never heard of and never seen. It's called The Duke of Burgundy. It's it's from the 2000s, but I can't remember exactly how old it is now. It's a small independent film. One of the things that's fascinating about it is that there are no men in the film whatsoever.
Oh,
only women characters. And not to spoil it, but like you'll figure this out pretty quickly. You see what at first seems like maybe an abusive relationship between two women who seem to also be very wealthy and are sort of living in this villa. And then you quickly come to realize it's a consensual role, like 24/7 power exchange, DS role play relationship, very deep. It's a weird film. It's inspired by 70s softcore Italian horror porn. So it's got this kind of like horror-y tone to it, but it doesn't actually ever really go there. And it feels very like a 70s softcore porn movie. It's like feels very kind of like gauzy and dreamy and sort of cerebral and weird. But it also does actually have a sense of humor about itself, which is pretty subtle and dry. But there's a great scene where the submissive character is basically like ordering the supplies that she wants to act out her fantasy. And you can see how in control the submissive is of like choosing the stuff. It's not the dominant who goes out and is like, oh, I'm going to buy you this, and this so we can do this fantasy. It's the submissive who's like, yeah, I want this. It's really expensive. I'm custom ordering it exactly to my specifications. And there's like a little tension between her and her partner about like, I don't know if we should spend this money, whatever. It's very realistic, I think, in terms of showing that just because the person is playing the role of the dominant doesn't mean they're actually in charge or in control or steering the relationship. Lots of times that's just the person in the submissive role, because both roles are a kind of elaborate game of pretend. So that movie is, I think, fascinating. And the relationship, the power exchange dynamic is really at the core of the movie. Often you'll see like there's a pro dom who walks on the screen for half a minute, or there's like one scene of blindfolding or something like that. But this movie is about their power exchange relationship.
Love it.
Yeah. For literature, I recommend anthologies edited by Rachel Kramer Bussell. She's edited things like The Big Book of Submission, Best Bondage Erotica, and she, goes through submissions and different kind of submission and and finds the best that's out there. And so those books have a really great range. I also love Sinclair Sexsmith as a writer themselves, but also the editor of things like Sweet and Rough, Queer, Kink, Erotica, and, a lot of things sort of in the DS power exchange SM space. I love Lana Del Rey's You Can Be the Boss as a song about a DS relationship. It's like, you can be the boss, daddy, you can be the boss. But it's clear in the song, like, she, the singer is like encouraging and attracted to the sort of bad boy persona, but you can see also that she's not, like, what it means for her to sort of be a submissive is again not passive. You can be the boss, daddy. Like, I'm giving you permission to enact this role. Not like you are the boss. Yeah. Like, because I choose that because I like it. And I love that little subtlety to it. And then I just have to give a shout out because the other day I heard this old song, the 80s new wave song by the band XTC. And I love the song and I've heard it many times, but I never really paid attention to the lyrics. It's called Grass, and it's about basically teenagers in love having sex outside, which itself is a little kinky. But also the second line of the song is, the way you slap my face just fills me with desire.
Oh my, I just got a little chills.
And it's a male singer. And then the whole song is just about like, over and over, we flatten the clover because they're taking a tumble in the grass.
Wow.
It's so cute and sweet. And it's a great song.
I'm into that. Yeah. I mean, I think, like, to your point earlier, like, it's hard to have stats on how many people are kinky, right? But I just genuinely feel like everyone has a little something that they are, like, interested in, or that they are, focusing on, that maybe is a little outside the quote unquote norm. Cause, like, what is the norm, right? Like, it's being rewritten all the time.
Exactly.
It's just kind of like okay, like, more quote unquote vanilla sex. Like, people are still having that, but, like, who knows what's going on in people's heads? Like, how do we know how kinky people are, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, it's totally culturally contextual. So what's kinky to us now might have been like what everybody did in such and such a place and time. We know that at other places and time, certain kinds of things that we think of as like completely taboo now were commonplace, like adult men having sex with young boys in ancient Greece, for example, or, foot binding or whatever it is. So yeah, I mean, that what we say, I'm very careful. It's very clear to me, and I hope I make it very clear in my book, like, being queer, for example, is not kinky. It's a sexual orientation, but at certain, places and times, sodomy, of course, like anal sex, has been outlawed and still is, I think, on the books in some places, even though we all know now that is the most maybe commonplace kind of sexual activity between two people with penises. Like, yeah, no big deal. But for in certain places in time, that was, absolutely verboten. So,
right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think, like, it's really important to mention what you just said in terms of, okay, like, being queer or having a queer identity doesn't inherently equal kinkiness. And at the same time, I do think folks in the queer community are more readily available to access like kinky conversations and acts. In your book, do you talk at all about kind of the overlap between queerness and the kink community in that way?
Yeah. Well, I mean, literally, I think there would be no kink community without queer folks, because the places where kink identity was historically formed and people learned things was through gay bars, leather clubs, leather families, just gay neighborhoods, which would historically have shops where you could buy, let's say, like leather, harnesses and things like that. We owe, all of us in the kink community owe an enormous debt to our elders in the queer community who fostered that kind of network and connection at a time when that was often illegal and dangerous, and you were risking persecution and jail time and things like that. There's wonderful overlap. There's wonderful historical overlap. And, this is a whole other conversation as we're recording this in Pride Month. But, the movement to unfortunately sort of like, I would say sort of sterilize Pride as this like family friendly event that's just like sanitized and corporate sponsors and all of that, and pushes kinky folks to the margins, is a huge disservice and not in keeping with our history, the history of Pride, which from its very beginning was inclusive of and even run by folks who identified as kinky within the gay, specifically gay and lesbian communities.
Totally. Yeah. Really, really important call out. Thank you for saying that. And I think that's a good way to put it, like sterilize, like this idea of like kind of like rainbow washing everything and just for, whatever capitalistic benefit, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, really, really important call out.
It's great that the new pride flag, which, is also more inclusive of trans identities and multiple kinds of gender, also is inclusive of like the kink colors, that the leather, specifically leather colors, and sometimes like bear community and things like that, which are all sort of like kinks within that were historically like within the gay and lesbian communities.
Totally. In your book, you have a couple of really, really fun quizzes, and I thought it could be really fun to kind of like close us out here on this episode if you can kind of like administer a couple of questions to me live. So listener, while you are hearing me answer, maybe it would help you reflect on your own answer and consider where you're at with kink and your kink journey.
Yeah, super fun. So I have a whole quiz about compatibility with a partner, because I think too often compatibility is thought of just in terms of like libido. And what does that even mean? Like, does that mean like how much sex you want to have, or how much you masturbate, or how much desire you just sort of have actively in your body at any given time? I don't know. Like, who knows really, there are good definitions about that. And Beacon is actually publishing a book about this question. But yeah, I mean, compatibility is so much more complex and layered than that, especially if you or your partner identifies as kinky, because you're probably not thinking about like, does my fetish match up with this person's, sexual desires? So the compatibility quiz starts out with some pretty, kind of vanilla questions, and then gets more deeply into kinky questions.
And so just a note, not to put my partner on blast. He's a completely different human. I'm going to act as if I'm dating myself because, I'm just going to answer for myself. Respect, my partner's kind of his own life, his own choices as to however he would or wouldn't want to say anything. So I'm just going to answer for myself.
Absolutely. And I pulled some questions that I thought would be good for that. So the first one is, as a general rule, like I love thinking about this as, some dogs are food motivated and some dogs are praise motivated. So as a human being, how sex motivated are you? Like, and how, like, so, and what does that mean to you? Like how important is sex in your life?
Yeah, I would say it is important. I wouldn't say it's like the most important thing. I think it's like just as important as other kinds of pieces for myself. So, for example, like physical touch, or I love like praise. We can talk about that. Love praise, love words of affirmation, really love, like love language, right? Like if we're thinking about sex as a part of like physical touch, then I definitely find other pieces really important. Quality time, access. Like I'm a huge spectrum of love languages kind of person to give and receive. So I would say it's important, but not the most important thing to me.
Yeah. And so with that in mind, how often, like if you could choose how often you had sex with a partner, how often would you say that was?
It's hard to put a number on it because I feel like it's so dependent on kind of like other things that are going on. But I feel like instead of just like partnered sex, I'm going to frame it as like pleasure in general. I feel like 2 times a week feels really good for me, where it's just like, okay, I'm like dedicating time to this / like if I feel those like butterfly, like horny feelings in my body and mind, then I want to act on them. So I think like 2 would be a good number per week.
Yeah. And I think that's so useful and interesting because I think there's a lot of assumptions about what it means to want sex frequently. And for some people, that could mean once a month. And for some people, that can mean twice a day. And you have to check in, right? Because you don't know what frequently means unless you ask.
Right.
So I think that's great. And and of course, it's going to depend on a million different factors. But I think I have found with partners in my past that they tend to have sort of pretty set cycles. Like I need to have sex about once a month to feel like regulated in my body and spirit, or I need to have sex once a week. I need to have sex once a day. Like that really varies from person to person. Okay, what tone do you tend to prefer your sex to have? Do you tend to like it to be more gentle or exciting or chatty or serene, or, because I think also we tend to think about that in terms of a binary of like rough or gentle, but there's so many different tones. I know people who like joking around while they're having sex. And I know other people who are like, no joking during sex, it has to be serious.
It's a serious thing. Yeah. I'm same kind of thing. Like, I think I'm not really someone who like wants it a certain way every single time. Like, I think like I get a lot of like pleasure and excitement out of like all different kinds of modes, whether that can be chatty, whether that can be kind of like being like in the submissive role or the dominant role, or like listening to certain music. Like, I think it really isn't like a stagnant thing for me. It's super kind of like dependent on my feeling in the moment.
Yeah. And again, like, I think that would be great. That's a great thing for a partner to know, because you could end up with a partner, right, who did have a very static notion of like, every time I want to go have sex, I want it to be like tantric and woo with candles and chimes or whatever, or, something else. And that maybe they would need a little help or encouragement to kind of think about a different tone that sex could have, that a sexual experience could have. And then let's do one more that's more about kink. So how do you feel about power dynamic in your dynamics in your erotic life? Like, do you like to have a little bit of power tension and play, or do you really feel more comfortable with a very egalitarian kind of approach where no one person has more power than the other, which I think as feminists, a lot of us are really trained to think that we want egalitarian sexual experiences, or sexual experiences that don't feel ever like they border on playing with things like danger or authority. But of course, that's not true for all feminists in terms of what we actually want.
Yeah, I very much in my everyday life am, and in the bedroom, everywhere I exist, am a feminist. And I very much like power dynamic play with my partner, and think that it is, again, not necessarily always like being dominated or the submissive one. It's like a both and kind of thing. And like maybe sometimes it does feel good to have it equal. Yeah, like for me. And that's why I find it really interesting when people just identify as like one or the other, because that is very much not my experience. Like, I really like to run the gamut and the full area of play, but I do really enjoy power dynamic play.
Yeah, which again, I think is a really good thing for partners to know, because I think also If you are a woman identified person who's partnering with a male, masculine identified person, a lot of really lovely, smart, thoughtful, masculine identified folks out there are understandably concerned that they don't treat a female identified partner with anything other than like total respect and, all of the good things we're taught. But that might not be what your partner wants in the bedroom. It's probably what they want everywhere else in life. Like I certainly want that everywhere else in life, but maybe not as much, in an erotic space. I'm somebody who in my everyday life is like super in control and opinionated and forceful and responsible and a planner and a mom and, somebody with a job. And I love in an erotic space to like let go of all that responsibility and be the sort of more submissive role. I almost never want to be in that dominant role because I feel like it's so much what I do.
It's too much already.
It's like, I'm already doing it. Thanks. Right. Got that. Not sexy to me.
Totally. Yeah. That's so awesome. Well, I'm so glad that you are here and that we had this very, very fun conversation around kink. And as you said, like this is an umbrella term. Like if you're someone who's listening and you're interested in learning more about your own kinky journey, definitely check out all of the quizzes and all of the information and amazing writing in Superfreaks by Arielle. And I'm wondering, Arielle, if you can share where folk can find you and learn more and read Superfreaks.
Yeah, thank you. I'm on Instagram with my sort of writerly account as Arielle_Greenberg, and I'm sure you'll put that in the show notes with the right spelling. And the book is coming out from Beacon Press, so you can go on Beacon's website to read all about the book, and you can order it from any place books are sold. Although, of course, we encourage you to go to your local independent bookstore.
Yes,
do that. Yes.
Amazing, awesome. And when is that? Has that?
It is out August 1st.
August 1st. So we have a little bit of time. So maybe can folks pre-order it?
They can pre-order it from Beacon. Yes. Or awesome. From your local independent bookstore. They can have it in for you as soon as it comes out.
Great. Yeah. Make a little note in your calendar or go pre-order it. Arielle, thank you so much for being on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to talk to you.
Our creator, host, and executive producer is me, Danielle Bezalel. Our producer and communications lead is Catherine Cohen. Our associate producer and communications coordinator is Sadie Leegee. Our marketing coordinator is Kate Fiala. Our music theme is by Hook Sounds. Thanks so much to our featured guests, partners, and listeners. Want to partner with us? Email us at sexedwithdb@gmail.com. For more sex ed content, follow us on Instagram @sexedwithdbpodcast and on TikTok @sexedwithdb. For exclusive content and to submit an anonymous sex ed question, check out my new podcast on Fridays, Curious Sex Ed, hosted with Mariah Caudillo of Sex Ed Files. Go to buymeacoffee.com/CuriousSexEd to learn more. See you next time.